Awesome. That's all that I have on the agenda. So without further ado, I'll kind of go off camera and off mic, and I'll turn it over to our presenters, Peter and Franklin.
All right, thank you, Sean and Peter. I think you're going to run the slides for me, correct? What I'd like to do first before we get started is just offer our gratitude. Thank you, Sean, Joshua, and also Lori, who for this opportunity to present to this group. Just really quickly, I'm going to introduce myself and then allow my colleague to introduce himself, and then we'll get started. And we're really looking forward to this opportunity. But I'm Franklin Cozy Gay. I'm the co-director of the Chicago Race Riot of 1919 Commemoration Project. This is something that we lead in our spare time as volunteers. My full-time work is actually working at the Trauma Center at the University of Chicago, directing a hospital-based violence intervention program known as the Violence Recovery Program. And I'm going to pass it to Peter to just do a brief introduction.
Hi there. Echoing Franklin, thanks to Shy Hack Knight's leadership team for inviting us. I'm a professor of history. I work downstate at Western Illinois University in Macomb. That's where I'm speaking to you from. I just had a class. And then I leave half my life in Chicago. So you'll see me there Thursday nights through Mondays. Yeah, I'll turn it back to Franklin.
Awesome, thank you. And so in the spirit of gratitude, what we like to do is just offer gratitude for and recognition of the native land in which we stand. We want to definitely recognize a few, but this isn't comprehensive of all the groups, but we certainly want to recognize the Potawatomi, Sauk, Fox, Winnebago, Illinois, Miami, Menominee, and Algonquin, to remind us that the city that we're in is a reflection of Chicago, which was a wild garlic plant that grew along the rivers and lake. And with that being said, recognizing the role that we're actually here, and Brian Stevenson often reminds us the fact that in this nation, we're actually a part of a post-genocidal society. And as the founder of Equal Justice Initiative and National Lynching Monument, one theme that we want to discuss today is how we can use public art to really tackle addressing atrocities of the past and confronting them. And so one thing that we want to level set on as a group is that when we use the word race riot in this context, what we're defining this as is racist mob violence perpetrated by white people against Black people, and Blacks also defending their right to their humanity. This term has changed over the past century, but we wanted to make sure that we highlighted that, and we can go to the next slide. So we are here today to really discuss some of the events that happened over 100 years ago, beginning with the death of a 17-year-old Black male named Eugene Williams, who quickly found out, along with his other friends, when they were seeking to escape the Chicago heat. Like many Chicagoans, would go to the lakefront to get some of the lakefront breeze. And also, if we can, and especially at this time, bathers use that as an opportunity to cool off. And Eugene Williams and his three buddies were no exception. The problem was that, unlike in the South, they quickly found out that despite that there's not de facto or de jure by law segregation, there is in fact de facto segregation. What does that mean? Essentially that Eugene and his friends would go to the beach, they wouldn't see signs that indicated Black or white beach or swimming area only, but they quickly found out and quickly knew that by using the force of violence and other constraints that that was enforced in that space at that time. Sorry about that. So with that being said, this is the context of what we're going to talk about today, about how this was the spark for an event that led to 537 individuals injured, of which 38 were killed, 23 were African American, 15 were white. And we want to dive into this story, and I'm going to pass it to Peter.
So just to dive back to the 19th century for a moment before we come back into the 20th, right? The Civil War ended in 1865, and shortly after, the U.S. Constitution experienced 3 amendments within the span of 5 years. The 13th Amendment freed the slaves or abolished slavery. The 14th Amendment granted equal rights to all people, although it was created at that moment in order to ensure that African Americans would be ensured equal rights. And the 15th Amendment, which granted Black men the right to vote. That was called the Reconstruction era. Unfortunately, there was growing opposition among Southern whites as well as non-Southern whites. And in 1877, after a really fraudulent, botched presidential election, African Americans experienced the fact that the white majority compromised on the backs of Black people and sacrificed Black equality in exchange for the Republican Party getting the White House and the Democratic Party getting Southern states back with federal troops being withdrawn. In the aftermath of Reconstruction, in the 1880s and especially 1890s, Southern whites started to develop new ways in order to, you might say, re-enslave African Americans. That often is just referred to as segregation, nicknamed Jim Crow. But if the law wasn't good enough, then there was always the very real possibility that violence would be enforced, basically inequality. And worst of all, lynchings, of which there were thousands in the late 1800s and early 1900s. That was in some ways the worst of African American history in the post-Civil War era. During World War I, which began in 1914, immigration from Europe plunged, demand for workers soared, and millions of American men, white and Black, were brought into the military. As a result, suddenly there's this massive demand for labor, right? And African American men and women, choosing their moment wisely, flee the South for what they hope is the so-called promised land outside of the South. That becomes nicknamed the Great Migration, and there are different waves of it. But Chicago and other industrial cities in the Midwest and the Northeast were essentially the destinations of choice for African Americans because there were many factory jobs there. In Chicago, the most well-known being steel and meatpacking. Although African Americans to Chicago significantly increased in just a few years, really doubling in population from 1915 to 1920, African Americans still made up fewer than 4% of the residents of Chicago. So although there's this massive increase, if we put it into perspective, 90%, 96% of Chicagoans still were not Black. But nevertheless, this massive increase, albeit still small, set off alarms for many many people of European descent and many European immigrants. Growing number during World War I of backlash against Black migration into northern and Midwestern cities. This is reflected in multiple ways. One is the rebirth of the Ku Klux Klan in 1915. We see an increase in lynchings across the country. We see really the most racist film of the silent film era. Birth of a Nation becomes the most popular film in the silent film era. If you've never seen it, you can YouTube watch a few minutes of it and you get the idea that it celebrates the Ku Klux Klan, right? In the city of Chicago, we also see that as more Blacks move in, white people start sort of expressing their anger through violence, including the photograph here on the right. As African Americans started to move into various neighborhoods, they were welcomed, quote unquote, with violence. For example, here where a Black family moved into a house, 34th in Indiana in what's now called Brownsville, and a 6-year-old Black girl was killed, right? And so Black people are arriving, they're starting to build some power, and they quickly experience a pushback. And we in particular highlight the fact that a lot of this is conflicts over neighborhoods and housing, as Blacks move into a neighborhood that's nicknamed the Black Belt. Keeping in mind that Black was a term that Black people rejected at that time. It was seen as a pejorative term. It wasn't until the 1960s that the term Black was essentially retaken by people of African descent. As Blacks move out of the Black Belt, they experience violence, right? And dozens of Black families were bombed before the events of the riot of 1919 and after. And in the space of 5 years, nearly 60 bombings in which not a single person was brought up on charges by the Chicago police. Franklin.
Thank you, Peter. And so when I opened up, just with a brief overview, I'd like to just kind of dive in a little bit more regarding July 27th, 1919. So Chicago, and I'm a South Side Chicagoan, and I grew up without air conditioning. 100 years ago, that was the standard, right? Like, so, and just like I did as a teenager, I went to the lakefront as a South Sider, Eugene Williams, and actually, I mentioned 3, it's actually 4, so 5 Black teenage boys were going to Lake Michigan to seek out the cool waters and the cool breeze that comes from the lake. And so, as I shared earlier, and Peter provided an example of just the context of America and what African Americans or Black people were escaping from the South, while legalized discrimination did not exist in the city of Chicago nor the state of Illinois, that de facto segregation was quite common. And the city beaches were typically exclusively for white people, with the exception of 25th Street that was right outside, just to the east of the quote unquote Black Belt. And so many people at that time did not know how to swim. My understanding, and I love being a colleague with Peter because Peter's a historian, and I can always kind of fact check with him. But the term bathing suit actually is reflective of the fact that many people didn't in fact know how to swim, so they were actually bathing to cool off. And so Eugene and his friends were industrious, created a makeshift raft, and that makeshift raft, think about just being out on the lake. The wind blows, it drifts into the quote unquote white part of the lake. And just as Peter described how whites were using house bombings to terrorize, but to also really try to constrain and restrict movement, the same thing happened with Eugene and his friends. There was George Stauber, a 24-year-old man, was enforcing this quote unquote white waters. And as a result of that, Eugene Williams drowned. And so let's keep in mind the dozen or so house bombings that happened. And as Peter highlighted, even afterwards, there's been this theme of no justice for the crime, no justice for the loss of life, for the loss of property. And so this is bubbling up, as the Ida B. Wells quote indicated before, that Chicago was indeed beginning to rival the South in terms of how they were handling race relations. And so with that being said, at the time, Black police officers could not, the Black bathers, everyone saw George Stauber throw the rock that caused Eugene Williams to die, and they simply wanted justice. So they brought in a Black police officer to go down to arrest the culprit, and the de facto segregation basically required that a white police officer arrest them. So he went to get his colleague, Daniel Callahan, and he refused to arrest Stauber. And so again, thinking about the injustices that have happened, that fueled outrage, and James Crawford, outraged, shot into a crowd wanting justice. And James Crawford was shot. He was the second person to die. What was really unique about this is that a Black police officer shot James Crawford because the Black police officer was indeed protecting the citizens. And so the same justice that they wanted for Eugene Williams, it's ironic that the second person that was killed was a Black man. And so tensions began to flame, and then rumors began to spread. And then a gang of what at that time is known as social athletic clubs were essentially clubs that were established that were really gangs, but they were really established to protect boundaries. And they weren't specific to boundaries connected to race, but also related to ethnicity. But they were definitely on the edge of the communities that were connected to the Black Belt, used to enforce these restrictions that exist. And I would argue that still exist to this day. And we're going to talk a little bit about that. But those rumors began to spread. And we can go to the next slide. Thank you. And so a result of that was that you had social athletic clubs that were going into Black neighborhoods, roving mobs that were looking for any Black person to attack, but it wasn't just people, it was also property. As a result of this, and this image here shows a 30-year-old stockyard worker who was heading home, was chased by approximately, 2 to 3 dozen white men and fatally beaten near 47th and Normal. And so 20 minutes later, another Black man was fatally stabbed while fleeing a mob. And so what we see is that there's an over-occupation of police officers in the quote unquote Black Belt that actually weren't enforcing the protection of the Black residents. They were essentially acting as gatekeepers. And what would happen is that there was not that protection in areas where most of the Blacks were employed, which included the stockyards. And so the result of this, really most of the deaths that occurred in the first 3 days. 2/3 of the individuals that were injured were Black. 2/3 of the individuals that were arrested were Black. And so this theme of the lack of justice continues to go on. It wasn't until a week later, really, it's argued that heavy rains drove people indoors. Also, the National Guardsmen finally were activated after a lot of tension by the Illinois governor. But a week later, finally, it began to decrease. This, as Peter described earlier, that this movement away from the terrorist South was not unique to Chicago in terms of the Great Migration, nor was the violence that was connected to the response of Blacks moving into spaces, either by homes or social spaces, and how violence was not only used in Chicago, but it was also used in 24 other cities across 15 states. And so that included Washington, D.C., that included in Omaha, Nebraska. There's a infamous photo of Will Brown that was also used as a postcard in some cases, a packing house worker who was brutally murdered. And so this was coined as the Red Summer because of the blood that was connected to the violence that was directed at Blacks in these cities and in these states. And at the same time, as Peter described earlier, World War I had ended a year before in 1918, and African Americans, especially in France, were bravely honored for their contributions in terms of quote unquote protecting democracy. And so this quote below, described by W.E.B. Du Bois, basically that they returned from fighting, defending democracy, but then they returned fighting. What we began to see, I described that there are 23 Blacks that were killed. There were 15 whites that were killed. Many of those whites were killed because they were actually Black soldiers that were defending. They were attacking perpetrators who were coming into the community, either burning homes. What I didn't share is there were thousands of businesses and homes were destroyed. So you had thousands of people homeless. You had hundreds of people whose business had been destroyed. But we had this fighting spirit. And so this is best captured by Claude McKay's quote, "If we must die, we must die like men facing the murderous, cowardly pack, pressed to the wall, dying, but fighting back." And so with that, this theme that's connected to constraint, containment, and disruption is a theme that for Peter and I have a public health background. Peter is a historian. And I'm really thankful about how we've connected. And before, in the public health sense, we steer away from blaming individuals to looking broadly at the overall environment. And you could think about an automobile, whether it's a seat belt, or you can go further back and think about the role that cholera played in terms of looking at the environment. It's not about individual behaviors, but it's actually about environmental factors. And so with that being said, before I met Peter, I would often talk about the role that policies and practices played that included policies connected to housing, whether it was restricted covenants or urban renewal programs. And then as cities like Chicago began to be browner and blacker cities, how the jobs and the businesses left because of these opportunities and policies that provided opportunities for white Americans to develop equity through housing, and those businesses followed them. And then instead, what you see is a timeline that's connected to the birth of a carceral age, that at the end, in the beginning of the 21st century, what you start to see is that 50 years later, you've had a 400% increase in mass supervision. And what I mean by that is individuals that are on parole or probation, but also incarceration rates. And then ultimately looking at the role that public housing has had in the disruption of a city that is not in fact engineered for Black Chicagoans. I'm going to pass it back to Peter, I believe. Thanks.
Yeah, hi there. So basically going back that slide before sort of gives you the big picture. We'll dive in a little quicker and deeper here. So, you know, the race riots were horrible, 38 people killed, 537 injured. They also looked really bad and were out of control, literally and figuratively. There are actually better ways that are legal, that are sort of overtly or seemingly peaceful ways to sort of contain Black people, because what was the 1919 race riots is essentially about containing Black people to a certain part of the city, right? Like, so restrictive covenants, which were legal documents added to property, say your house deed or your building deed, that literally denied Black people the opportunity to move into properties. And in the 1920s, across much of the South Side, and then later other parts of the city, these restrictive covenants were added to deeds that very clearly and legally at that time prevented Black people from moving into large parts of the city, right? And so as more Black people moved into the city in the 1920s and beyond, they increasingly were constrained in this so-called Black Belt, right? So restrictive covenants, one way that Black people were further contained using other means than racist mob violence. A second way, which you might already be thinking about based on what I said in the previous slide, is this term called redlining, right? Which is sort of a term that actually develops in the late 1930s, but is a term we continue to use today, which is sort of a suite of policies created by the federal government, but also sort of practiced by the banking industry, the real estate industry, and the construction industry, with the active support of many white Americans to, again, contain Black people. Literally speaking, in the 1930s, the federal government is trying to protect homeowners, but also the real estate and finance industries, create a series of policies to help some Americans be able to buy or invest in properties and homes. But those policies systematically denied Black people access, right? And then the government color-coded neighborhoods based on race, red being neighborhoods where Black people lived. And banks then took these color-coded maps and essentially instrumented policies that followed along with these maps. So Black neighborhoods were color-coded red, and they were red-lined, meaning that banks will not loan money in these neighborhoods, which means that you cannot buy property. If you need to borrow money, you cannot to improve your homes, et cetera. Right. Those policies lasted well into the 1970s. A third example of how government sort of was involved directly was after World War II, when the federal government invested billions and billions of dollars in both federal highways and public housing. And this photograph really tells it all very quickly. To the left-hand side of the photograph, which is west, is Bridgeport. To the right-hand side of the photograph is Bronzeville, renamed by the community in the 1930s. And right in the center is a 10-lane highway built in the 1950s, opened in the early 60s, called the Dan Ryan Expressway. To the west was Mayor Daley's neighborhood. He was also a member of one of those athletic clubs that was involved in the violence in 1919. That highway was constructed intentionally to basically seal off Bridgeport, a predominantly white neighborhood, from the growing African-American community in Bronzeville. And then at that time, 28 16-story public housing buildings known as the Robert Taylor homes were constructed. The way I'm describing this and the way we are describing this is not unique, of course, to Chicago. Similar things, especially with highways, where it's happening in city across city in the 1950s. I'll turn it back to Franklin.
No, thank you. And if you just think about that or that visual that Peter showed, one thing that I want to highlight is on that west side, as Peter described, that's Mayor Daley's neighborhood. That's the Bridgeport community. You just can visually think about, or Peter, if you wouldn't, yeah, thank you. So you see the green and you see that. So that line that's right next to the highway was Wentworth Avenue, just to demonstrate the power of what we're describing in terms of policies versus physical violence used to contain. That street, Wentworth, in 1919 was described as the deadline. What did that mean? That meant that any Blacks that were going west of that street would be met with brutal violence by the social athletic clubs. Now, instead of having physical violence in place, you have policies and practices. Thank you. And so that was also, again, like recognizing the power of building equity through real estate was viewed as an American right and a way to really have to be mobile as a family, as an individual. And so as a result of that, there was this ripe opportunity for predatory housing contracts to be sold to Black Americans. And what was happening is that they actually were not a mortgage in itself, but it was a contract that was really set up for you to lose that home in any investment that you put in that home. There's a great report that we'll make sure to share that it's out of Duke University and their Social Equity and Policy Center, the Samuel Du Bois Cook Center. And it highlights this predatory housing contracts contributed to a $3.2 to $4 billion wealth gap between Black Chicagoans and white Chicagoans, right? Housing alone contributes to that gap. And so when you're thinking about it, if you're thinking about some of these like folded map projects that our wonderful colleague, partner who does some amazing work does, you think about the consistency of a street and how Halsted might look different in Inglewood than in the way it looks Roscoe Village, for example, or Lakeview. That's what I was trying to say. This story helps you really kind of understand why our city looks like a tale of two different cities. We can go to the next slide. Thank you. And as I highlighted before, as whites were leaving the city, right, to take advantage of these policy opportunities connected to housing, as suburbanization began to grow and businesses started to flow, we started to see a reinvestment in terms of how the city's budget was being allocated and hyperinvestment in policing. And the theme connected to this, again, is the role that police violence has played in Chicago for over 100 years. What's highlighted in this photo is, of course, 1919 to the left, and to the right is Fred Hampton, who was violently murdered while he was sleeping. But in the middle is actually the Laquan McDonald. And so what we really try to highlight is the role of policing and how that has further constrained and been a consistency in terms of violence for Black Chicagoans. And so, all right, so we broke down a lot of this history, the motivation. We firmly believe, and I'm really grateful for the relationship with Peter, because as I shared before, my timeline really just went back to restricted covenants. And although as a Southsider, my dad was a CTA bus driver, I knew about the 1919 race riots. Many don't. And in a country like the United States, unfortunately, we tend to operate that we hope that forgetting will lead to healing. But it's actually, we believe that the Chicago Race Riots in itself is the origin story for segregation in Chicago. And we also believe that it's actually good public history to acknowledge the things that have happened in the past if we're really serious about changing. Luckily, there's growing civic and community readiness for public projects to commemorate the 1919 Chicago Race Riots. We're really proud of the work that we've been able to accomplish. Peter and I essentially met about 4 years ago, what we've been able to accomplish in the past 4 years, but that is also related to a lot of positive things that are happening. which include some of the work that's was led from the Chicago Torture Justice Project, which also through that was a reparations one, which included a $5.5 million settlement for victims and a mandatory history curriculum on police misconduct, racist police misconduct. The fact that the city has created its Office of Equity and Racial Justice, and also a public monuments project that is really analyzing how we're facing our history, what role, how do we contextualize our history. As a result, if you're driving down the former Congress Avenue, which is kind of like the center, Center Street in the city of Chicago, is now Ida B. Wells, right? We know that if you're driving through Grant Park in Hutchinson Field, just north of the Field Museum, you'll notice that the Columbus statue is not there. And I'll be really interested in hopeful to talk about these conversations around the removal of monuments, or how we place monuments, or how we contextualize it. But most importantly, what I really love is what Peter discovered when he was in Germany. So I'm gonna pass it back to Peter. And you're on mute, Peter.
Thank you very much. So in the United States, we continue to do a particularly poor job of remembering this history. That might be why none of you really know much about the history of 1919 or the Red Summer, right? It's simply not taught. By contrast, in Germany, there is an incredible amount of interest in and education about the history of the Holocaust. And so the image on the left is of the Lakeshore Trail, very close to where Eugene Williams was murdered. There's a small marker that you probably didn't know existed. By contrast, on the right-hand side is a 5-acre monument in the heart of the capital of Berlin in Germany, where they have a monument to the murdered Jews of Europe. In addition, one of the projects that I'm most impressed with in Germany is called Stolpersteine, which in English means stumbling stones. So that if you're walking down the streets of German cities like Berlin, as I sometimes have had the good fortune to do, you come across one or multiple small brass plaques embedded into the ground outside of the last known home of someone who was a victim of the Holocaust. You stumble across this knowledge. You are perhaps provoked to think about the Holocaust when you had rather not. This small, subtle public art project has grown so that there's now tens of thousands of these markers across Germany and other countries in Europe. And the idea for our project is quite simple. It's that we believe that we could use that sort of idea to sort of apply that to the history of 1919 in Chicago. We believe that the reason that the contemporary city of Chicago is so deeply segregated by neighborhood is because we failed as a community to sort of recognize the horrors of the past, right? That the racial violence of Chicago, which contributed to the segregation of Chicago, continues to impact the city of Chicago. And until we know this history, we are going to be condemned to sort of repeat the past in all of its problems. As a result, the Chicago Race Riot of 1919 Commemoration Project was created, and we do, through various ways, sort of try to raise this history, including obviously speaking with you tonight. I'll let Franklin speak a bit longer, but mindful of time.
Yeah, I got you, Peter. Again, Peter and I met January of 2019, and we met in a historic Roberts Temple, which is where Mamie Till had an open casket for her son, Emmett Till. So just the fact that we met there, it was connected to a larger mobilization campaign that was community-led and coalition-based that focused on making sure that it was high-quality programs, violence prevention programs for families and for youth, that they were trauma-informed, and that there was equity and social justice. As a result, it was easy to really mobilize many of the individuals to get them connected behind this project. But what we were very pleased that also we were able to secure funding from Niantic to help us with the public art. Let me go to the next slide. And so part of what we've done during that process is, of course, lecturing from elementary school to graduate school. But what I'm most proud about is the work that we've been able to do through our bike tours. And ultimately, what we've been able to do in terms of connecting to the survivors of violence today to this story. So we were very pleased to connect with through this mobilization work with Firebird Community Arts and their Project Fire. This is a trauma-informed program through Healing Hurt People Chicago that trains youth impacted by trauma and injured by violence to actually create glass and blow glass, and then also train and teach. And so Peter's showing a couple of the prototypes, but essentially we have been able to get support from Niantic to make sure that they have the money to create the art. And since then, we have received support from the Department of Cultural Affairs and Special Events for the Chicago Monuments Project to actually install the art. And so our goal is to install 5 markers near our 103rd, the 103rd anniversary of the 1919 race riots, where we opened up where Eugene Williams was killed. This year's event will be on July 22nd, and we're aiming to have all 38 markers installed by the end of the year. Peter kind of showed you a couple of the prototypes. I'll pass it back to Peter so we can talk a little bit more about our historic tours. Thank you.
Yeah, just to sort of wrap things up. So, we try to give presentations, and if anyone wants us to speak to another group of people that you're involved with, we're always happy to do in-person and virtual presentations. We give historic tours of Bronzeville and Bridgeport because there's no better way to see sort of segregation than to experience segregation. We do so on bike because we believe it's a wonderful way to experience the city. But if you don't like to bike, we also have foot tours and bus tours. And like Franklin said, we do an anniversary event around the time of the murder of Eugene Williams and the riots. And this year it'll be on Saturday, July.
Thank you so much. If you have, I don't know if you have more to share. This was really, really great. I feel like maybe if you want to stop sharing your screen, there we go. Perfect. Thank you. Awesome. Thank you so much. This was really, really awesome work. And thank you for sharing that with us. We have a few audience questions just to kind of get us started. Someone asked, what impact, if any, did the 1919 events have on the creation of our current community areas?
Sorry, current community areas?
I think like thinking about like Bronzeville or even like our wards or like that's what it said, community areas, but I think like thinking about like our whatever we call our neighborhoods, whether we're talking about a ward or our neighborhoods. So
absolutely. I mean, we strongly believe that this was the actual shaping, and we're talking about our 77 community areas that are synonymous with our neighborhoods. You can really still feel, as I attempted to highlight on that one photo, that there is clear, like tangible segregation that exists in Chicago, but it has a story, and it's a story that many individuals need to know, because unfortunately, we live in a society where we push kind of, individual like hard work and then even the collective spirit in itself, but not really understanding the mechanisms that are at play that shape those that have and those that don't. Peter and I strongly believe that the race riots served as an origin story for this. And as the Black community did begin to spread out, the house bombings that Peter described earlier that happened between 1917 and 1921, that wasn't the end of that story, right? So as Black communities start to spread out, I grew up in the Park Manor community, which is in the 70s, close to Martin Luther King Drive. Around the corner, my grandparents were migrants from the South. They landed in Bronzeville until they purchased their first home in 1955. There was a house bombing across the street There was a very notable house bombing that happened a few years before that in the late 40s over on St. Lawrence as well. So those house bombings continued. And so the physical violence didn't just end there, but the 1919 race riots was the beginning of that story. And as the Black and brown communities, especially in this context, Black communities began to spread, there were opportunities for whites, and you hear this term white flight, to leave. But it wasn't just that the people left, the economic base left, and then the mechanisms in terms of how we're engaging residents shift, because what essentially was happening was that the civil rights movement was actually being policed, right? And so those mechanisms shape the birth of the carceral age. And so strongly believe that they had a strong role as the beginning, kind of the impetus, the driving force for what we see now in terms of the shaping of these neighborhoods. But I'll see what Peter has to add to that.
I have nothing else to add. That was great. We're happy to answer other questions if they.
Oh yeah, we definitely have questions. Someone kind of more specific, I think, back towards maybe like the first half of your presentation. How much do we know about what role the future mayor back in 1919 may have played in the events of 1919?
So the first Mayor Daley was 17 years old and graduated high school in the spring of 1919. He was 17 years old. Eugene Williams was 17 years old, the first person to be killed. Richard Daley went to high school in what we now call Brownsville on 35th Street at De La Salle Institute, coincidentally just north of the Chicago Police Headquarters now. He lived in Bridgeport, he walked to school, and he was a member of something called the Hamburg Athletic Clubs. The Hamburg Athletic Club was one of the athletic clubs that's really sort of a political violence gang that sort of gets out the vote or kills you if you vote the wrong way, right? However, they also were used by people like politicians, like council members, aldermen, and the like, to sort of inflict violence. Now, Mayor Daley was a member of this club, and a few years later, he became president of the Hamburg Athletic Club, and that building still exists on a side street in Bridgeport. However, he never directly answered the question on whether he was involved in the violence of July of 1919. Many people have strong opinions on if he did or didn't. There's no direct proof. However, his membership in one of the pivotal gangs that perpetrated violence is suggestive of what his role might have been. And that decades later, when in power, he sort of created the Dan Ryan Expressway to protect his neighborhood, if you will, is further evidence that he didn't really wasn't very sympathetic to the needs of African-American citizens of his city.
Thank you. All right. Probably have time for maybe like a couple more questions. I think the big one, this is for me and for our listeners as well. Are there any ways that volunteers who are interested in supporting this work could get involved? And if not, maybe through volunteer efforts, like how would you prefer our listeners to support this?
Peter, I know you were making a plug for, we are deeply appreciative of this group and the tech expertise that this group has. Separately, Peter and I were making a plug to Sean around potential support, looking at our website, ways to improve our website. We want to make sure that you have that information. One thing that was left out in our presentation is that one of the descendants of those social athletic clubs, Therese Reagan, the largest social athletic club, the gang, the Reagan Colts, has since donated $20,000 for us to go towards reparations for the victims. Peter and I, our primary goal is getting the art installed. We're very close. We're very proud of what we've been able to collectively do with our partners to get to that place. But our next step is particularly around reparations and supporting that fund. And so if anyone's interested in genealogy or knows someone, that would be tremendous for us to think about as phase 2 of our project. But Peter, I don't know if you have some other ideas.
I just would echo what Franklin said. I created our website, but I don't know anything, and it's a WordPress website, but if any of people at Shy Hack Night want to assist us in making, enhancing our website and other tech, we are be very happy. No volunteers are turned away. Yeah. So thank you for that. I also dropped into the YouTube chat, like if people do want to donate money, we could use money, but we're not primarily asking for money. We'd love people's help if they want to be involved.
Yeah,
Thank you.
we have a free bike ride. You know, we've had hundreds of rides, on average, maybe about 175 riders each year. It's a tremendous event. We've lucked out. We've had great weather every year. But if we'd love for you to participate, it's not just about the areas that are connected to the violence, but also areas connected to resilience and resistance. We'd also make sure that you come out if you can to our July 22nd event, and we're hoping to unveil some public art at that event as well. So
awesome. And then somebody asked specifically, I think, links for the bike tours, but I'll kind of just expand that a little bit. Are there any like links you want us to share out that we can, or other things you want us to know are the best ways to get keep up to date with goings-ons?
Into the YouTube chat, I dropped our handle at Chicago Race Riot on Twitter, Facebook, and Instagram. You can sort of get on our mailing list if you email us, but you could also just follow us on social media. And our website, chicagoraceriot.org, also will be where we will have more information about our tours. And we should also say that we give these tours on demand. So if you are part of a group of people who want to sort of have a tour, we can actually make that happen, right? But our big event, like Franklin said, which draws 200 to 300 people, is around the anniversary of the events of late July, 1919.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much. I think that's probably all the time that we have this evening. I know this was really powerful work that I'm so grateful that you shared with us tonight. So thank you for there's one part of the evening I didn't tell you about, is I'm contractually obligated to say this next dorky part to our audience out there. So just bear with me. But for everyone who tuned in this evening, remember to hop on for the Zoom channel, which someone will post somewhere. There it is, right there. Hop on that Zoom link if you're looking to continue, and go forth and hack. Good night, everybody. Thank you.